During my exam, my gynecologist stopped mid-procedure and said, "Your husband deserves better than this body." I was in the most vulnerable position possible when Dr. Harrison said it while my feet were still in the stirrups, and the nurse was standing right there pretending to organize supplies. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" I tried to sit up, but he put his hand on my shoulder to keep me down. "I said your husband deserves better." I saw him in the waiting room. Handsome guy, athletic build, and here you are 40 pounds overweight, making no effort. It's sad, really. The nurse Catherine kept her eyes on her clipboard, but I could see her jaw clench. "Are you seriously commenting on my body during a medical exam?" I grabbed the paper gown tighter around me. "Doctor." Harrison pulled off his gloves with a snap. "I'm a doctor. It's my job to notice these things. You've gained 18 pounds since last year. Your husband gained 0. I checked when he brought you in for that UTI last month. The contrast is concerning. He wrote something on my chart. I'm recommending you for nutritional counseling and a gym membership. Your insurance won't cover it, but your marriage might depend on it." I sat up despite his protests. "This is completely inappropriate." He laughed. Actually laughed while I was half naked on his exam table. "Inappropriate? I'm trying to save your marriage. You know what I see every day? Women who let themselves go, then act surprised when their husbands find younger models. Your husband's what, 32? The prime of his life. You're 35 and looking 45. Do the math." The nurse finally spoke. "Doctor Harrison, perhaps we should continue with the exam." He waved her off. "We're done here. Everything looks normal down there. Well, medically normal. Aesthetically, that's another story. Have you considered grooming? Your husband probably appreciates a certain maintenance level that you're not providing." He pulled out a business card. "This is my wife's salon. They do waxing. Tell them I sent you and they'll give you the desperate housewife discount." I snatched my clothes from the chair. "I need to get dressed. Please leave." But he kept talking while writing in my chart. "You know your husband was reading fitness magazines in the waiting room? Not good. When men start looking at perfect bodies in magazines, it means they're not satisfied with what they have at home. I'd say you have maybe 6 months before he starts wandering. Less if someone from his gym makes a move." He looked up at me. "Does he go to the gym a lot? Without you?" I was shaking with anger. "Get out of this room now." He stood but didn't leave. "I'm also noting that you declined the birth control prescription. Trying for a baby? Bad timing. Nothing kills a marriage faster than pregnancy weight on top of existing weight problems. Your husband will definitely cheat then. They always do. I've seen it hundreds of times." The nurse moved toward the door. "Dr. Harrison, we have other patients." He ignored her and pulled up something on his tablet. "Look at this. It's a study about marriage satisfaction correlated with weight gain. Women who gain more than 15 pounds in the first 5 years have a 70% higher divorce rate. You've gained 40 in 3 years. Statistically, your marriage is doomed unless you take action now." He showed me before and after photos on his tablet. "These are my other patients who took my advice. Losing the weight saved the marriage. This one's husband bought her a Tesla after she dropped 4 dress sizes. This one got a second honeymoon in Bali. What did your husband get you for your last anniversary?" I didn't answer, but he kept going. "Nothing special, right? Because why would he celebrate being married to someone who doesn't take care of herself?" The nurse Catherine suddenly stepped between us. "Dr. Harrison, I need to speak with you in the hall. Now." He looked annoyed but followed her out. I could hear her voice through the door. That was completely unethical. I got dressed as fast as possible and opened the door to find them still arguing. Other patients were watching from the waiting room. "Doctor." Harrison saw me and called out, "Remember what I said. 6 months maximum before he finds someone else." I walked past him toward the exit, but he followed. "I'm scheduling you for a follow-up in 3 months. We'll see if you've made any progress." My husband stood up from his chair in the waiting room looking confused. "Everything okay, doctor?" Harrison reached him first. "Just discussing some lifestyle changes your wife needs to make. For your sake." He clapped my husband on the shoulder. "You're a patient man. Not many guys would stick around with that kind of physical deterioration. Says a lot about your character." My husband pulled away from him. "What the hell are you talking about, doctor?" Harrison smiled. "Just medical observations. Your wife can fill you in, but between us man to man, you deserve better. My wife maintains herself beautifully even after 3 kids. Happy to give you her trainer's number if your wife won't use it." The waiting room was dead silent. Every patient and staff member was staring. The office manager appeared from behind the desk. "Dr. Harrison, can I see you in my office?" My husband stepped between us before Dr. Harrison could say another word. His jaw was set in a way I'd only seen twice in our marriage, both times when someone had really crossed a line. Every patient in the waiting room stopped moving. The receptionist froze with her hand on the phone. Even the fish tank in the corner seemed to go quiet. My husband's voice came out low and controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath it. "Doctor." Harrison actually took a step back. The office manager was already moving toward us from behind the desk with her hands raised like she was trying to calm down a dangerous situation. My husband didn't yell, but somehow that made it worse. He told Dr. Harrison exactly what he thought of him in words I won't repeat here, then grabbed my hand and started walking toward the exit. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold my purse. "Doctor Harrison called after us that we were being dramatic and that he was only trying to help. My husband stopped walking. He turned around so fast that Dr. Harrison actually flinched. The look on my husband's face could have melted steel or frozen hell or whatever metaphor works because it was terrifying and I wasn't even the target. We left without saying anything else because there was nothing else to say. In the parking lot, I made it 3 steps toward our car before I started crying. Not quiet tears either, but full-body sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest. My husband wrapped his arms around me right there between 2 minivans and let me fall apart. He kept saying he was sorry over and over. Sorry for not knowing what was happening during the exam. Sorry for reading that stupid fitness magazine in the waiting room, which apparently Dr. Harrison had used against me. Sorry for not protecting me from something he couldn't have possibly known about. I told him it wasn't his fault through the crying, but I don't think he believed me. A woman walking to her car saw us and quickly looked away. I didn't care. Let everyone see. Let them all know what that doctor did. My husband said we were going to report this and make sure Dr. Harrison never did it to anyone else. I nodded against his chest because I couldn't speak yet. We stood there for probably 10 minutes while I cried, and he held me and the sun beat down on the parking lot asphalt. That evening, my husband set up his laptop at the kitchen table while I sat on the couch trying to process what had happened. He found the state medical board website and started reading through complaint procedures out loud. Patient rights violations, professional misconduct, sexual harassment in medical settings. Each category seemed to fit what Dr. Harrison had done. He grabbed a notebook and started making a list of everything Dr. Harrison had said. Every comment about my weight, every mention of my husband, the salon business card, the before and after photos, the statistics about divorce rates, the comment about grooming. Writing it all down made it feel more real and somehow worse. I had to correct him twice because he got the order wrong. My brain had apparently recorded every horrible word in perfect detail. We worked on the list for over an hour until we had 3 pages of notes with timestamps and exact quotes as close as I could remember them. My husband kept clenching his jaw while he wrote. When we finished, he closed the notebook and said we had enough to bury that guy. The next morning, I called the medical practice before I could talk myself out of it. The receptionist answered in her cheerful voice, and I asked for my complete medical records. Her tone changed immediately. She put me on hold for almost 5 minutes. When she came back, she said the office manager wanted to speak with me. I was transferred to another line where a woman's voice asked if I could come in to discuss my concerns in person. I said no. I wanted to file a formal complaint right now over the phone about Dr. Harrison's conduct during yesterday's exam. There was a long pause. She asked me to hold again. This time I waited for 7 minutes. Finally, she came back and said she was documenting my complaint and would forward it to the practice owners. She asked me to come in to discuss the incident. I told her I'd come in, but only with my husband and only to pick up my records. She agreed, and we set up a time for 2 days later. When I hung up, my hands were shaking again, but this time it was anger, not fear. 2 days later, my husband took the afternoon off work, and we drove back to that office. I made him park in a different spot because I couldn't look at the place where I'd broken down crying. The office manager met us in a conference room instead of the waiting area. She was probably 50 with gray hair pulled back tight and a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had a folder in front of her with my name on it. She thanked us for coming in and said she took my complaint very seriously. My husband asked if Dr. Harrison was still seeing patients. She said he was currently on administrative leave pending an internal review. That surprised me. I'd expected them to defend him or brush it off. She pulled out a form and asked me to describe what happened. I went through the whole thing again while she took notes. She didn't react to any of it, which made me wonder how many times she'd heard similar stories. When I finished, she said she was documenting everything and forwarding it to the practice owners and their legal team. My husband asked how many other complaints they'd received about Dr. Harrison. She paused too long before saying she couldn't discuss other patients. That pause told me everything. There had been others. The office manager slid a piece of paper across the table. She said the nurse Catherine had also submitted a statement about what she witnessed during my exam. Reading those words made something loosen in my chest. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't overreacting. A medical professional who was in the room agreed that what happened was wrong. The office manager said Catherine's statement corroborated my account and would be included in the internal review. She also said Catherine had mentioned trying to intervene during the exam and again in the hallway afterward. My husband asked what would happen next. The office manager said the practice owners would complete their review and make a decision about Dr. Harrison's employment. She recommended I also file a complaint with the state medical board since they handled licensing issues. She actually recommended it herself, which seemed significant. We left with my medical records in a manila envelope and slightly more hope that something might actually happen. That same week, I filed the formal complaint with the state medical board. The online form was incredibly long and detailed. It asked for dates, times, specific statements, witnesses, and supporting documentation. I had to describe exactly what Dr. Harrison said and did, including the most humiliating parts. There was a section for uploading documents, so I scanned my medical records and the timeline my husband and I had created. The form took almost 2 hours to complete because I kept having to stop and compose myself. My husband sat next to me the whole time, even though he had work emails piling up. When I finally hit submit, he squeezed my hand. The confirmation screen said my complaint had been received and assigned a case number. It said someone from the medical board would contact me within 2 weeks to discuss next steps. I wrote down the case number in 3 different places because I was terrified of losing it. 3 days later, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer because I hate spam calls, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice said she was Janelle Melton, an investigator with the state medical board assigned to my case. She wanted to schedule an interview to get my full statement and explain the investigation process. We set up a time for the following week at a medical board office downtown. She said the interview would take approximately 2 hours, and I could bring someone with me for support. She also said this type of investigation typically took several months because they had to interview witnesses, review records, and build a complete case. Several months sounded like forever, but at least something was happening. After we hung up, I felt lighter somehow. Someone official was taking this seriously. Someone whose job was to hold doctors accountable was actually investigating. The interview with Janelle took place in a small windowless office that smelled like coffee and cleaning products. Janelle was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with dark hair and a kind face. She had a recording device on the desk and a thick folder with my case number on it. My husband sat in a chair against the wall while Janelle asked me questions. She wanted me to start from the beginning and describe everything that happened in exact detail. So I did. I told her about the stirrups and the paper gown and feeling vulnerable. I repeated every comment Dr. Harrison made about my weight and my husband and my marriage. I described the salon business card and the before and after photos and the statistics. I explained how he followed me into the waiting room and spoke to my husband directly. Janelle took notes the entire time and didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she said his behavior clearly violated multiple medical ethics standards, including professional boundaries, patient dignity, and appropriate conduct during intimate examinations. She said my complaint was being taken very seriously, and they already had Catherine's witness statement and the office manager's documentation. She couldn't tell me about other complaints due to confidentiality, but her tone suggested there were others. The interview lasted almost 3 hours instead of 2 because Janelle was so thorough. When we finally left, I felt exhausted but validated. This was real. This was actually happening. A week later, Janelle called again and asked if I could come back to her office for a follow-up meeting. She said she had some additional information about the investigation that she wanted to share with me in person. My stomach dropped because I didn't know if that meant good news or bad news. When I arrived at the medical board office, Janelle looked more serious than she had during the first interview. She closed the door and sat down across from me with a thick folder on her desk. She explained that during their investigation, they had discovered 2 other formal complaints filed against Dr. Harrison in the past year. Both complaints involved inappropriate comments about patients' bodies during exams. One woman said he told her she looked like she'd given up on herself and her husband probably noticed. Another woman said he spent 10 minutes during her exam talking about how obesity was destroying her marriage prospects. Both complaints had been filed with the medical board, but the investigations had stalled because the patients didn't want to pursue them further after the initial report. Hearing this made me feel sick and angry at the same time. Dr. Harrison had done this to other women and nobody stopped him. He just kept practicing and kept humiliating patients, and the system let him continue. Janelle said my complaint was different because I was willing to see it through, and because Catherine's witness statement provided corroboration that the medical board rarely got in these cases. She said they were taking my case very seriously and building a strong file for potential disciplinary action. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those other women and how scared they must have been to just drop their complaints. I understood why they did it because going through this process was exhausting and scary, but I also felt determined not to let Dr. Harrison get away with this pattern of abuse. My husband found me at 2 in the morning sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing. He sat down next to me and asked what I was thinking about. I told him about the other complaints and how angry I was that the medical board knew about Dr. Harrison's behavior, but he was still seeing patients. My husband was quiet for a minute and then he said maybe I should talk to a lawyer. He said the medical board complaint was important, but maybe there were other legal options I should know about. He said he wanted me to have every possible tool to hold Dr. Harrison accountable. The next morning, my husband started researching attorneys who specialized in medical malpractice and patient rights cases. He made a list of 5 lawyers and started calling their offices to ask about free consultations. Most of them were booked out for weeks, but one office said they had an opening the following afternoon. The lawyer's name was Gabriella Paget, and her assistant said she had extensive experience with medical misconduct cases. My husband scheduled the appointment and took another day off work to come with me. Gabriella's office was in a building downtown that looked professional but not fancy. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and medical law journals on the coffee table. When Gabriella came out to meet us, she was maybe 50 with gray hair and a firm handshake. She led us into her office and asked me to tell her everything that happened from the beginning. So I went through the whole story again. The exam table and the stirrups and every comment Dr. Harrison made, the waiting room confrontation and the office manager's reaction, the medical board complaint, and Janelle's investigation. Gabriella took notes the entire time and asked specific questions about timing and exact words. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and explained that I had grounds for both a civil lawsuit against Dr. Harrison, and the medical practice, and for supporting the medical board's disciplinary process. She said Dr. Harrison's conduct violated my patient rights and constituted medical misconduct. She said the practice might also be liable if they knew about his behavior and didn't stop it. Then she explained that she worked on contingency, which meant I wouldn't pay anything unless we won the case. She would take a percentage of any settlement or judgment, but I wouldn't have to pay upfront legal fees. This was huge because I had been worried about how much hiring a lawyer would cost. Gabriella said she wanted to take my case and that she thought we had a strong claim based on what I'd described. She said her investigator could start gathering evidence right away if I decided to hire her. I looked at my husband and he nodded. I told Gabriella I wanted to hire her and move forward with building a case against Dr. Harrison. She pulled out a contract and explained all the terms clearly. I signed it and felt like I was taking real action instead of just waiting for the medical board to do something. Gabriella said her investigator, Lucas Paget, would contact me within a few days to start gathering evidence. She explained that Lucas would request records from the medical practice and interview potential witnesses, including Catherine, if she was willing. Gabriella said having a nurse witness was extremely valuable because medical professionals rarely spoke up against doctors they worked with. She asked if I had any way to contact Catherine directly, and I said no, but I could probably get her information through the medical practice. Gabriella said Lucas would handle that and would be very respectful of Catherine's position. 3 days later, Lucas called me and introduced himself. He had a calm voice and explained that he'd been working with Gabriella for 15 years on medical malpractice cases. He said he wanted to start by requesting my complete medical records from Dr. Harrison's practice, including any notes from the exam where the incident happened. He also wanted to request their policies on patient complaints and professional conduct. Lucas said he would send formal record requests that day, and they had 30 days to respond. He also asked if I felt comfortable reaching out to Catherine to see if she would be willing to give a formal statement to my attorney. I said I would try, but I didn't know if she would talk to me. I spent 2 days working up the courage to call the medical practice and ask for Catherine. When I finally did, the receptionist said Catherine was with a patient, but she could take a message. I left my number and said it was important. Catherine called me back that evening after she got off work. Her voice was cautious when she said my name. I told her I had hired an attorney, and that my lawyer wanted to know if she would be willing to give a formal statement about what happened during my exam with Dr. Harrison. There was a long silence, and then Catherine said she wanted to help, but she was scared of losing her job. I told her my lawyer had mentioned something about whistleblower protections for medical staff who report misconduct. Catherine said she would think about it and asked for my lawyer's contact information. I gave her Gabriella's number and thanked her for even considering it. 2 days later, Gabriella called me sounding excited. She said Catherine had contacted her and agreed to give a formal statement after Gabriella explained the legal protections available to her. Catherine was meeting with Lucas the next week to provide a detailed account of Dr. Harrison's behavior during my exam and her attempts to intervene. Gabriella said Catherine's statement would strengthen my case significantly because she could describe the medical setting and Dr. Harrison's violation of professional standards from a clinical perspective. Having a nurse willing to testify against a doctor was rare and powerful. Lucas worked fast. Within 2 weeks, he had gathered my medical records and started interviewing people. He called me one afternoon with information that made my blood boil. He said he'd been investigating the medical practice's history and discovered that their insurance company had paid out 2 previous settlements involving Dr. Harrison's inappropriate conduct with patients. The practice had kept him on staff despite knowing about his pattern of behavior. Lucas said this added institutional liability to my case because the practice had been on notice that Dr. Harrison was a problem, and they did nothing to protect patients. He was still gathering details about those previous settlements, but the fact that they existed meant the practice couldn't claim my complaint was isolated or unexpected. They knew Dr. Harrison behaved inappropriately with patients, and they let him continue practicing anyway. Gabriella said this information changed the strategy for my case because now we could argue the practice was negligent in their oversight and created an unsafe environment for patients. She said the insurance company would probably want to settle once they realized how much evidence we had of the practice's knowledge and inaction. But dealing with all the legal stuff was taking a toll on me mentally. I was having trouble sleeping and kept replaying the exam in my head. I felt anxious all the time and started avoiding situations that made me feel vulnerable. My husband noticed I was struggling and suggested I talk to someone professional about what I was going through. He found a therapist named Aaliyah Carson who specialized in medical trauma. I was hesitant at first because I'd never been to therapy before, but I agreed to try one session. Aaliyah's office was in a quiet building with soft lighting and comfortable furniture. She had a gentle way of talking that made me feel safe. During our first session, I told her about the exam and Dr. Harrison's comments and how violated I felt. Aaliyah listened without interrupting, and then explained that what I was experiencing was a normal response to a serious abuse of power. She said medical settings require patients to be physically vulnerable and trust their doctors to maintain professional boundaries. When a doctor violates that trust, it creates a specific type of trauma because the person who was supposed to protect you became the person who hurt you. Hearing her explain it that way made me feel less crazy for being so upset. She said we would work together on processing the experience and managing the anxiety it created. Over the next few weeks, I saw Aaliyah every Tuesday afternoon. During one session, I realized I'd been avoiding all medical appointments since the incident with Dr. Harrison. I had canceled a dentist cleaning because just the thought of being in a medical chair made my heart race. I'd skipped my annual physical with my regular doctor. I'd even avoided going to urgent care when I had a bad cold because I couldn't handle the idea of being examined. Aaliyah helped me understand that this avoidance was my brain trying to protect me from feeling vulnerable again. She taught me breathing exercises and grounding techniques to manage the panic I felt in medical settings. She said we would work on gradually exposing me to medical appointments again, but at my own pace. Just knowing I wasn't alone in feeling this way, and having tools to cope with it, made a huge difference. I started sleeping better and feeling less on edge all the time. Meanwhile, Gabriella was moving forward with the legal case. She called me one morning in early November and said she was sending a formal demand letter to Dr. Harrison, the medical practice, and their insurance company. The letter would outline my case, including detailed descriptions of Dr. Harrison's conduct, Catherine's witness statement, and the practice's negligence in keeping him on staff despite previous complaints. The letter would request a settlement to resolve the matter without going to trial. Gabriella said this was standard procedure and would give us a sense of whether they wanted to settle or fight. She said the insurance company would probably respond within 2 weeks. I asked what would happen if they refused to settle, and she said we would file a lawsuit and take it to court. She said she was confident in our case either way, but settling would be faster and less stressful for me. I told her to send the letter and we would see what happened. Waiting for their response felt like forever. I checked my email constantly and jumped every time my phone rang. Gabriella had said they had 15 business days to respond, but I was hoping they would answer sooner. The response came exactly 14 days after Gabriella sent the demand letter. She called me and said the medical practice's attorney had sent back a settlement offer. I could hear in her voice that she wasn't impressed. She said they were offering a small amount of money and requiring me to sign a confidentiality agreement that would prevent me from discussing the case publicly or with other potential victims. Gabriella said the offer was insultingly low, and the confidentiality clause was designed to protect Dr. Harrison more than compensate me. She advised me strongly not to accept because agreeing to stay silent would let Dr. Harrison continue harming other patients without consequences. She said we should counter with a much higher settlement amount and refuse any confidentiality requirements. I agreed immediately because the whole point of doing this was to hold Dr. Harrison accountable and protect other women from going through what I did. Taking money to stay quiet would defeat that purpose completely. I called Gabriella that evening and told her we needed to reject the offer. She sounded pleased when I explained that accepting money to stay silent would let Harrison keep hurting other women. My husband sat next to me on the couch nodding while I talked, and when I hung up, he squeezed my hand and said we were doing the right thing even if it meant more stress. Gabriella sent the rejection letter the next morning with a counteroffer that included much higher compensation and absolutely no confidentiality requirements. She said the practice's insurance company would probably push back hard because they wanted this buried, but we were prepared for that fight now. 2 days later, Janelle called with news that made my stomach flip. 3 more patients had filed complaints about Harrison after hearing about my case through the medical board's internal network. She said the investigation had expanded significantly, and Harrison was now facing potential license suspension instead of just a reprimand. The medical board was treating this as a pattern of misconduct rather than isolated incidents, which meant much more serious consequences. Janelle walked me through what would happen next, including a formal hearing where Harrison would have to answer to all the complaints together. She said the timeline was probably 3 to 4 months before the hearing date got scheduled, but the investigation was moving faster than usual because of the number of victims coming forward. Lucas called me a week after that and asked if I could meet him at Gabriella's office to discuss something important he'd found. I drove there the next afternoon and found both of them waiting in the conference room with files spread across the table. Lucas explained that he'd tracked down 2 of Harrison's former patients who had filed complaints years ago and accepted confidential settlements. Both women had signed agreements preventing them from discussing their experiences publicly, but they were willing to talk to us privately to help build the case. Lucas had recorded their statements with their permission, and he played the audio for me while Gabriella took notes. The first woman described an exam almost identical to mine, where Harrison told her that her boyfriend would leave her if she didn't lose weight and get cosmetic procedures. The second woman said Harrison had shown her before and after photos of other patients and suggested her husband was probably cheating because of her appearance. Both women were in tears during parts of their statements, and both said they'd accepted the settlements because they felt powerless and wanted the whole thing to be over. Hearing their stories made me realize how calculated Harrison's behavior was, how he knew exactly what to say to make vulnerable women feel worthless. Lucas said he was still trying to find other former patients who might have settled quietly, and Gabriella said these statements would be crucial for proving Harrison had a long history of this conduct. The pattern became obvious once we laid out all the complaints chronologically. Harrison specifically targeted women he perceived as overweight or not meeting his standards of attractiveness. His comments were always framed as medical concern or marriage advice, which gave him cover to claim he was just being a caring doctor with poor bedside manner. But the consistency across different patients over 8 years showed this wasn't accidental or well-intentioned. It was systematic harassment disguised as medical advice, and the practice had enabled it by settling complaints quietly, instead of disciplining him or reporting him to the medical board. Gabriella said this pattern would be the foundation of our lawsuit, because it proved the practice knew Harrison was dangerous and kept him on staff anyway. Gabriella filed the formal lawsuit 3 weeks later against both Harrison and the medical practice. The complaint argued that the practice was liable for knowingly retaining a doctor with a documented history of patient abuse. She sent me a copy of the filing, and I read through the legal language describing everything Harrison had done to me and the other women. Seeing it written out in official court documents made it feel more real somehow, like validation that this wasn't just in my head or me being too sensitive. The local news picked up the story 2 days after the filing, though they didn't use my name or any identifying details. The headline was about a gynecologist facing multiple complaints for inappropriate conduct during exams, and the article mentioned the lawsuit without going into graphic details. After the news story ran, Gabriella's phone started ringing constantly. 4 more women contacted her office within the first week, all describing similar experiences with Harrison. One woman said he'd told her during a prenatal exam that pregnancy weight was ruining her body, and her husband would resent her for it. Another said Harrison had commented on her grooming and suggested she visit his wife's salon for maintenance. The scope of Harrison's misconduct was far larger than anyone had realized. Gabriella said we were now looking at potentially 8 to 10 victims spanning at least 8 years of practice, and she was considering whether to convert this into a class action lawsuit to hold the practice accountable for the full extent of the harm they'd allowed. The medical practice finally suspended Harrison without pay 5 days after the 4th woman came forward. Their attorney called Gabriella requesting a settlement meeting to discuss more serious terms. Gabriella told me this was the first sign they were actually scared, because before this they'd been treating the whole thing like a nuisance they could pay to make go away. Now they were facing a public scandal with multiple victims and a doctor whose license was about to get suspended. She said we had significant leverage now and could push for real institutional changes as part of any settlement, not just money. I had my regular therapy session with Aaliyah the day after Harrison got suspended, and something shifted during our conversation. I was able to articulate clearly that Harrison's comments weren't about my health or my marriage at all. They were about exerting power over me when I was at my most vulnerable, using his position as a doctor to make me feel worthless and afraid. Understanding this helped me separate his abuse from my actual self-worth, because his words had nothing to do with reality, and everything to do with his need to control and demean women. Aaliyah said this was a major breakthrough in my healing process, recognizing that the problem was his abuse of power, rather than anything wrong with me. My husband and I started having longer conversations about how the whole incident had affected our relationship. He admitted one night while we were making dinner that he'd been struggling with anger and guilt since the waiting room confrontation. He felt helpless watching Harrison follow me out and say those things, and he kept replaying the moment, wondering if he should have done something different. I told him he'd handled it perfectly by getting me out of there and supporting my decisions about how to respond, but he said the feeling of powerlessness was eating at him. I suggested he talk to someone too, maybe find a therapist who could help him process the anger and guilt he was carrying. He agreed to look into it, and I felt relieved that he was willing to get support instead of just trying to tough it out. Janelle called in early December to tell me the medical board had scheduled Harrison's formal hearing for late January. She said I would need to testify about what happened during my exam, along with the other patients who had filed complaints. The thought of testifying made my chest tight and my hands shake, but I knew it was necessary if we wanted Harrison to actually lose his license, instead of just getting a slap on the wrist. Janelle walked me through what the hearing would be like and what kinds of questions I should expect, and she promised the board members took these cases seriously and would treat me with respect. I hung up feeling scared but determined, because this was my chance to make sure Harrison never did this to another woman again. Gabriella spent 3 hours with me the week before the hearing, sitting across from me at her conference table with a yellow legal pad full of questions. She asked me to describe the exam room, what I was wearing, where Harrison stood, exactly what he said word for word. I stumbled over some details at first because reliving it made my throat tight, but she kept redirecting me back to facts instead of feelings. She told me the medical board would ask similar questions, and I needed to stay calm and specific, not let my emotions make me sound unreliable. We practiced my answers until I could recite the timeline without crying or getting angry, just stating what happened like I was reading from a report. Gabriella reminded me that I'd given the same account to the office manager, to Janelle, to Lucas, and now to her, and that consistency made me credible no matter what Harrison's attorney tried to claim. She said my detailed memory of his exact words, down to the desperate housewife discount comment, showed I wasn't exaggerating or making things up. By the end of our practice session, I felt more prepared than scared, like I had armor made of facts that Harrison couldn't break through. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, more like a conference room than a courtroom, with a long table where 5 medical board members sat with folders and laptops. Harrison sat at a table on the left side with his attorney, a man in an expensive suit who kept whispering to him. I sat at a table on the right with Gabriella, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. The board chair, a woman with gray hair pulled back tight, asked me to state my name and describe what happened during my appointment. I looked straight at her instead of at Harrison and told her everything, starting with being in the stirrups when he made the comment about my husband deserving better. Harrison shifted in his chair and wrote something on a notepad, his expression annoyed like this was wasting his time. His attorney objected twice, saying I was characterizing Harrison's intent instead of just reporting facts, but the board chair overruled him both times. Seeing Harrison look irritated instead of sorry actually made it easier to keep talking, because it proved he still didn't think he'd done anything wrong. I described every comment he made, the business card for his wife's salon, how he followed me into the waiting room, what he said to my husband. The board members took notes and asked clarifying questions about whether Catherine was present the whole time and whether I'd asked him to stop. When I finished, the chair thanked me and said Catherine would testify next. Catherine walked in wearing scrubs from her new job and sat in the chair I'd just left. She looked directly at the board members when she spoke, her voice steady and professional. She confirmed she was in the exam room the entire time and heard everything Harrison said to me. She described how she tried to redirect him by mentioning other patients, how she suggested we continue the exam, but he ignored her completely. Then she said this wasn't the first time she'd witnessed him making inappropriate comments to patients about their weight or appearance, that she'd reported concerns to the office manager twice before, but nothing changed. Harrison's attorney jumped up and objected, saying Catherine's other observations weren't relevant to my specific complaint, but the board chair said they were absolutely relevant to establishing a pattern of behavior and told Catherine to continue. Catherine described 2 other incidents in detail, including one where Harrison told a patient her stretch marks were disgusting and her husband probably couldn't look at her naked anymore. The board members exchanged glances and wrote more notes. Catherine's testimony as a medical professional carried weight that mine alone couldn't, because she had no reason to lie and everything to lose by speaking up against a doctor she'd worked with. After Catherine finished, 3 other women testified one by one about their experiences with Harrison. The first woman, who looked about my age, described how Harrison commented on her pubic hair during a routine exam and suggested her boyfriend would prefer her waxed. The second woman, older with gray streaks in her hair, said Harrison told her that women her age shouldn't let themselves get flabby because it made them unattractive to their husbands. The third woman, younger and visibly nervous, explained that Harrison had made comments about her breast size and asked if she'd considered implants to keep her partner interested. Each story followed the same pattern, Harrison using his position as a doctor to make degrading comments disguised as medical concern or relationship advice. The board members looked more disturbed with each testimony, the woman chair pressing her lips together in a thin line and the man on the end shaking his head slightly. Harrison kept writing notes and whispering to his attorney, but his face was getting red and his jaw was clenched. By the time the third patient finished, the room felt heavy with the weight of all these violations stacked together, proof that this wasn't about my sensitivity or misunderstanding, but about Harrison's systematic abuse of vulnerable patients. Harrison's attorney stood up for his turn and argued that his client's comments were legitimate medical observations delivered with unfortunate word choices. He said doctors had a duty to discuss weight, hygiene, and lifestyle factors that affected health, and that some patients were overly sensitive to necessary medical advice. He pulled up studies on his laptop about obesity and relationship satisfaction, trying to prove Harrison was citing real research. But when Harrison himself took the stand to testify, everything his attorney built up collapsed. The board chair asked Harrison if he understood why his comments might have been inappropriate, and he said patients needed to hear hard truths even if it hurt their feelings. She asked if he thought it was professional to comment on a patient's aesthetic appearance during an exam, and he said he was trying to motivate me to take better care of myself for my marriage. His tone was defensive and dismissive, like the board members were overreacting just like I had. One of the male board members asked Harrison directly if he thought telling a patient her husband deserved better was appropriate medical advice, and Harrison actually said yes, that sometimes shock tactics were necessary to get through to people in denial about their health. His attorney tried to interrupt and redirect, but Harrison kept talking, saying he'd helped dozens of patients improve their lives by being honest about their physical shortcomings. Every answer made him look worse, proving he genuinely believed he had the right to judge and shame patients under the guise of medical care. The board members left to deliberate, and we sat in the hallway for 2 hours. Harrison and his attorney stayed in the hearing room. I texted my husband updates, and Gabriella made phone calls while Catherine sat with me on the bench, both of us not saying much. When the board members called us back in, the chair read from a prepared statement. She said the board found clear and convincing evidence that Harrison had violated professional ethics standards by making inappropriate personal comments to multiple patients during medical exams. She said his behavior constituted a pattern of harassment that created a hostile and demeaning environment for patients seeking necessary medical care. Then she announced their decision to suspend Harrison's medical license for a minimum of 2 years, with reinstatement only possible after completing ethics training and working under supervision for an additional year. It wasn't permanent, but it was significant, taking him out of practice for years and putting conditions on his return. Harrison's face went from red to pale, and his attorney started talking about appeals. The chair continued that the board was also referring the case to the state attorney general for potential criminal investigation of patient abuse. I felt Gabriella squeeze my hand under the table. Outside the hearing room, 2 of the other patients who testified approached me and Gabriella. The younger woman asked if she could join my civil lawsuit against the practice because she wanted them held accountable too. The older woman said the same thing, that the license suspension was good, but the practice needed to pay for enabling Harrison all these years. Gabriella explained that we could pursue a class action approach where all the victims sued together, which would be stronger than individual cases, and force the practice to take institutional responsibility. She said class actions also meant we could demand broader policy changes that would protect future patients, not just get individual compensation. Both women said they were interested, and Gabriella took their contact information. Standing in that hallway with other women who'd been through the same abuse, I felt less alone than I had since the whole thing started. We weren't just individual victims anymore, but a group demanding change. 2 weeks after the hearing, Gabriella called to say the medical practice's insurance company had made a serious settlement offer. She came to my house with a folder full of documents and sat at my kitchen table explaining the terms. The offer included financial compensation for each plaintiff based on the severity of our cases, plus a collective fund to cover therapy costs for anyone who needed it. More importantly, the practice agreed to implement new patient safety protocols, including mandatory chaperones for all intimate exams, a confidential feedback system for patients to report concerns, and annual ethics training for all staff. They also agreed to publish these policies publicly on their website and in the waiting room. Gabriella said the insurance company wanted to settle now to avoid a trial that would expose more details about how long they'd known about Harrison's behavior and done nothing. The compensation amounts were substantial, enough to cover my therapy costs with Aaliyah for years plus money left over. But accepting the settlement meant no trial, no public courtroom testimony that newspapers could report on. Gabriella spread the settlement documents across my table and walked me and the other plaintiffs through every detail during a conference call. She explained this was a strong offer that accomplished most of what we wanted, real money and real policy changes that could prevent future patients from experiencing what we did. But she also said the decision was completely ours to make, that she would support whatever we chose. The other women on the call asked questions about whether the settlement would be public record and whether we could still talk about our experiences afterward. Gabriella confirmed the settlement itself would be public, but our individual compensation amounts would stay confidential, and there was no gag order preventing us from sharing our stories. One woman said she wanted the practice to admit wrongdoing publicly, not just agree to policy changes. Gabriella explained the settlement included a formal apology acknowledging their failure to protect patients and their commitment to doing better. We agreed to think about it for a few days before deciding as a group. I talked it over with my husband that night while we made dinner, chopping vegetables and discussing whether the settlement felt like enough justice. He said Harrison losing his license was huge, that the suspension meant he couldn't hurt anyone else for years. I agreed, but part of me still wanted a trial where everything would come out publicly, where a judge would validate how wrong his behavior was. My husband pointed out that we'd already achieved significant consequences, that Harrison was suspended and the practice was implementing real reforms. At my next therapy session, I asked Aaliyah what she thought about the settlement. She reminded me that closure doesn't always come from external validation, but from internal peace, and asked whether accepting the settlement or going to trial would help me heal better. I realized that dragging this out for months or years of trial preparation would keep me stuck in victim mode, while accepting the settlement and moving forward would let me reclaim my life. The license suspension and mandatory reforms felt like meaningful change that would outlast my individual case. I called each of the other women individually over the next 2 days to talk through the settlement offer. Most of them sounded relieved to finally have an end in sight. One woman named Sarah said she couldn't face a trial where she'd have to testify publicly about what happened to her. Another woman said the money would help her pay for the therapy she needed to process everything. We scheduled a conference call with Gabriella for the following afternoon to make our final decision as a group. During that call, we went around and each woman shared her thoughts. Everyone agreed that the compensation was fair and that the policy changes felt meaningful. Nobody wanted to keep fighting just to fight. Gabriella reminded us that we'd already accomplished something huge with the license suspension and that the settlement would create lasting protections for future patients. We took a vote and it was unanimous. All of us agreed to accept the settlement terms. Gabriella said she'd notify the medical practice's attorneys and start the paperwork process. The whole thing would be finalized within a few weeks. The settlement documents arrived at Gabriella's office about 10 days later. She walked me through every page during an appointment, explaining what each section meant. The compensation amounts were based on a formula that considered how severe each woman's experience had been and how much it had affected her life. My amount was substantial because of how aggressive and prolonged the harassment was during my exam. There was also a collective fund specifically for therapy costs that any of us could access for up to 5 years. The policy changes section was detailed and specific. The medical practice had to implement mandatory chaperones for all intimate exams starting immediately. They had to create a patient feedback system where people could report concerns anonymously. They had to establish a zero-tolerance policy for any inappropriate conduct by medical staff. Most importantly, they had to conduct annual training on professional boundaries and patient dignity, with an independent medical ethics consultant overseeing the program. Gabriella pointed out that these changes would protect patients long after our individual cases were resolved. The practice also had to publish their new patient safety policies on their website and in their waiting rooms. Everything would be public and transparent. I signed the settlement agreement right there in her office. My hand shook a little while I wrote my name, but I felt good about the decision. The settlement payment came through about 3 weeks later. I opened the envelope from the medical practice's insurance company and found a check along with a formal letter from the practice owners. The letter acknowledged their failure to protect patients from inappropriate conduct. It said they took full responsibility for not addressing concerns about certain staff members sooner. It committed them to creating a culture where patient dignity and safety came first. The apology felt genuine, not like legal language written by attorneys trying to avoid liability. I read it twice and then showed it to my husband. He said it sounded like they actually understood what they'd done wrong. The money was enough to cover several years of therapy with Aaliyah, plus pay off some medical bills we'd been carrying. I deposited the check and scheduled my next therapy appointment for the following week. With the legal case finally resolved, I focused more on my own healing. Aaliyah and I worked through the anxiety I still felt about medical appointments. She gave me tools for managing panic when I had to see doctors. We practiced what I would say if any medical professional ever made me uncomfortable again. I learned that I could leave an appointment at any time, that I could request a different provider, that I had rights even in vulnerable medical situations. After a few months of this work, I felt ready to schedule a physical with a new doctor. My old primary care physician had retired the year before, so I needed to establish care with someone new anyway. I asked friends for recommendations, and several people suggested a doctor named Jennifer Huang. She was about my age, had great reviews online, and specialized in women's health. I called her office and scheduled an appointment for the following month. The receptionist was friendly and asked if I had any specific concerns or accommodations I needed. I appreciated being asked. The appointment with Jennifer Huang was everything my experience with Harrison wasn't. She introduced herself and shook my hand before starting the exam. She explained each step of the physical before doing it and asked permission to proceed. She focused entirely on my health, asking about my medical history and any symptoms I'd been experiencing. When she did the physical exam portions, she was professional and efficient. She never commented on my appearance except to note clinical observations relevant to my health. She asked about my stress levels and sleep patterns because those things affected overall wellness. She recommended some routine blood work to check my vitamin levels and thyroid function. The whole appointment felt respectful and safe. I left her office feeling like I'd been treated as a person, not judged or evaluated. The positive experience helped me rebuild trust that not all medical professionals would abuse their power. I scheduled my next annual exam before leaving and actually felt okay about it. A few weeks after my appointment with Jennifer Huang, I got a text message from Catherine. She said she needed to talk to me about something important. We met for coffee at a place halfway between our homes. Catherine looked different from she had at the medical practice, more relaxed and less stressed. She told me she was leaving the practice where Harrison had worked. She'd accepted a position at a women's health clinic that had better ethical standards and actually valued their staff. She thanked me for coming forward about what happened, because it gave her the courage to demand a better work environment. She said watching me fight back made her realize she didn't have to stay in a place that tolerated inappropriate behavior. Her new clinic had strict protocols for patient safety, and staff were encouraged to speak up if they saw problems. She felt good about going to work there. I told her I was proud of her for making the change and that she'd been brave to speak up as a witness in my case. We talked for over an hour about how the whole situation had affected both of us. She admitted she'd lost sleep over not intervening more forcefully during my exam. I reminded her that she did intervene and that her testimony had been crucial. We exchanged numbers and promised to stay in touch. About a month after the settlement was finalized, I got an email from a patient advocacy organization I'd never heard of. They'd learned about my case through the public settlement documents and wanted to know if I'd be interested in speaking at one of their meetings. The group helped people navigate medical complaints and taught them how to stand up for themselves in healthcare settings. They met monthly and brought in speakers who'd successfully advocated for themselves or others. I thought about it for a few days before responding. The idea of sharing my experience publicly felt scary, but also potentially meaningful. I talked it over with Aaliyah during our next session. She pointed out that I'd moved from being a victim to being a survivor, to potentially being an advocate for others. I decided to say yes. The speaking engagement was scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving me time to prepare. I worked with Aaliyah on what I wanted to say and how to tell my story in a way that would help others without re-traumatizing myself. The organization sent me an outline of topics they hoped I'd cover, including how to file complaints, what to expect during investigations, and how to protect yourself emotionally through the process. My husband suggested we take a weekend trip to celebrate the case being resolved. We hadn't had any real relaxation since the incident 4 months earlier. He booked a cabin in the mountains about 2 hours away. We left on a Friday afternoon and spent the weekend hiking, reading, and just being together without the stress of legal proceedings hanging over us. On Saturday night, we sat on the cabin's deck watching the sunset. My husband told me he was proud of how I'd fought back against what happened. He said watching me advocate for myself made him love me even more. He admitted he'd felt helpless during a lot of the process, wanting to fix things but knowing this was my battle to fight. I told him his support had meant everything, that knowing he believed me and stood by me gave me the strength to keep going. We talked about how the whole experience had changed us as individuals and as a couple. We both agreed we communicated better now, that going through something difficult together had strengthened our relationship. The weekend felt like a reset, a chance to remember who we were beyond the trauma and legal battles. 2 weeks after our trip, I got a phone call from Janelle at the medical board. She had news about Harrison. He'd decided not to pursue reinstatement after his suspension period ended. Essentially, he was giving up his medical license rather than going through the process of proving he'd changed and deserved to practice again. His medical career was over. Janelle also told me that 2 other doctors at his former practice had left following internal investigations. The practice had looked into their conduct after the settlement and found concerning patterns with both of them. They'd resigned before facing formal discipline. The whole culture at that practice was dismantled and rebuilt. Janelle said my complaint had triggered a much larger examination of how that office operated. She thanked me for coming forward and said cases like mine helped protect future patients even beyond the individual situation. I felt a sense of closure hearing that Harrison wouldn't be treating patients anymore. The thought of him continuing to practice had bothered me even after the settlement. The medical practice published their new patient safety protocols on their website about a month after the settlement was finalized. They sent out a public statement to local media outlets announcing the changes. The statement acknowledged past failures in protecting patients and outlined their commitment to doing better. The new protocols included mandatory chaperones for all intimate exams, no exceptions. They created a patient feedback system where people could report concerns either directly or anonymously through a third-party service. They established a zero-tolerance policy for any inappropriate conduct by medical staff, with immediate suspension pending investigation for any complaints. They committed to annual training on professional boundaries and patient dignity, overseen by an independent medical ethics consultant who would report directly to the practice owners. The statement included contact information for the ethics consultant, so patients could reach out directly if needed. Reading the public statement felt validating. These weren't just private promises made in a settlement agreement. They were public commitments that the practice would be held accountable for keeping. About 3 weeks after the settlement closed, Gabriella forwarded me an email from a woman named Sarah, who'd seen the news coverage about my case. She wrote that she'd been a patient of Harrison's 4 years ago, and he'd made comments about her body during her postpartum exam that made her feel terrible about herself. She'd switched doctors but never reported him because she thought maybe she was being too sensitive. Reading about my case helped her understand that what happened to her wasn't okay. She thanked me for speaking up and said knowing other women experienced the same thing validated feelings she'd been carrying for years. Gabriella sent me 2 more emails like that over the next few days. One woman said Harrison told her during a routine exam that her husband probably wasn't attracted to her anymore because of stretch marks. Another said he'd commented on her grooming choices in a way that made her feel disgusting. Both women had switched doctors, but assumed they were isolated incidents. They wanted me to know that coming forward helped them process their own experiences and recognize the pattern. I cried reading those messages, but they were good tears. Knowing my complaint helped other women understand they weren't alone made everything I went through feel worthwhile. 6 months after the incident at Harrison's office, I woke up one Saturday morning and realized I'd slept through the whole night without nightmares. I made coffee and sat on the back porch watching the sun come up and noticed I felt genuinely okay. Not just surviving, but actually doing well. My morning routine felt normal again instead of something I had to force myself through. I scheduled a dentist appointment without having a panic attack about being vulnerable in a medical setting. I went grocery shopping and didn't avoid the aisle where they sold fitness magazines because seeing them didn't trigger flashbacks to Harrison's comments. The trauma hadn't disappeared completely, but it stopped controlling my daily life. I could think about what happened without my chest getting tight and my hands shaking. I could talk about the case without feeling like I might cry. The weight I'd been carrying around for months started to lift and I could breathe easier. I decided to write a detailed review about my experience on 3 different medical rating websites. I used my real name because I wanted other patients to know this actually happened and wasn't just an anonymous complaint. I described exactly what Harrison said during my exam and explained the full process of reporting him through the medical board and filing a civil lawsuit. I outlined the settlement terms, including his license suspension and the policy changes at the practice. I ended each review by saying that if a doctor makes you uncomfortable during an exam, trust your instincts and report it because you deserve better care. Within 2 weeks, 4 other patients added their own reviews about uncomfortable experiences with Harrison. One woman described how he'd pressured her to get cosmetic procedures during what should have been a routine checkup. Another detailed comments he made about her weight that had nothing to do with her actual medical concerns. The pattern became visible to anyone who looked at his ratings, and the reviews created a public record that couldn't be erased or settled away with confidentiality agreements. My husband and I were sitting on the couch one evening watching a movie when he paused it and said he wanted to talk about something. He told me that going through the whole situation with Harrison's case had changed our marriage in ways he didn't expect. Not bad changes, but real ones. He said watching me fight for myself and make decisions about the legal process without needing him to rescue me or tell me what to do made him respect me even more than he already did. He admitted that early in our relationship he'd sometimes tried to solve problems for me instead of supporting me while I solved them myself. The case taught him how to show up for me without trying to control my choices. We talked for over an hour about how we communicate differently now and how we're better at discussing difficult topics without one of us shutting down or getting defensive. We both agreed that navigating a crisis together strengthened our relationship because we learned we could handle hard things as a team. The trauma of what happened was real, but it led to growth in our marriage that wouldn't have happened otherwise. At my next therapy session with Aaliyah, she suggested we try moving to monthly appointments instead of weekly sessions. She said I'd made significant progress in processing the trauma and developing tools to manage anxiety around medical settings. I felt nervous about reducing our sessions because therapy had been such an important anchor for me over the past 6 months. Aaliyah reminded me that I could always increase frequency again if I needed to, and that spacing out sessions was a sign of healing, not abandonment. She pointed out that when we started working together, I was in crisis mode, barely functioning and terrified of all medical appointments. Now I was back to my regular routines, sleeping well, and even volunteering to help other people navigate medical complaints. She said I'd moved through 3 distinct phases from victim to survivor to advocate, and that transition showed real growth. Hearing her frame my progress that way made me realize how far I'd actually come. I agreed to try monthly sessions and left her office feeling proud of myself instead of scared. I joined a patient rights advocacy organization called Medical Justice Alliance that works to improve accountability in healthcare. They needed volunteers to help other people navigate the complaint process when they experience medical mistreatment. My experience with the medical board investigation and civil lawsuit made me a valuable resource because I understood how overwhelming and confusing the system can be. I started taking calls from people who'd had bad experiences with doctors and didn't know what options they had. I walked them through the steps of filing complaints, explained what to expect during investigations, and connected them with attorneys who specialized in medical malpractice. Helping other people advocate for themselves felt empowering in a way I hadn't expected. Every call I took reminded me that speaking up about Harrison hadn't just helped me, but created a path for others to follow. The local medical community started implementing changes in response to my case and the publicity around it. 3 other medical practices in the area announced new patient feedback systems where people could report concerns either directly or through anonymous third-party services. The hospital where Harrison had privileges before moving to private practice updated their policies to include mandatory ethics training for all physicians. A coalition of women's health providers published new standards for professional conduct during intimate exams, including requirements for chaperones and explicit consent protocols. The Medical Society newsletter featured an article about maintaining patient dignity and respecting boundaries that referenced my case without naming me specifically. Gabriella told me that ripple effects from accountability cases like mine often reach beyond the individual situation and push whole communities to examine their practices. Seeing actual policy changes happen across multiple institutions made me feel like the fight had been worth it. I scheduled my next annual exam with my new doctor without feeling anxious about it for the first time since Harrison's abuse. I walked into the office and filled out the intake forms and sat in the waiting room reading a magazine like it was no big deal. When the nurse called my name, I followed her back without my hands shaking or my heart racing. During the exam, I advocated for myself by asking questions about what my doctor was doing and why, and she answered everything clearly and respectfully. She never made a single comment about my appearance that wasn't directly related to my medical health. She treated me like a whole person, instead of just a body to evaluate. Being able to go through a routine medical appointment and feel safe and respected felt like reclaiming power that Harrison had tried to take away from me. I left the office feeling good about taking care of my health instead of violated and ashamed. My husband and I attended a fundraiser for the Medical Justice Alliance at a hotel downtown on a Thursday evening. The organization was raising money to expand their volunteer program and provide free legal consultations for patients who couldn't afford attorneys. I wore a blue dress and felt nervous about being at an event where people might recognize me from the news coverage about my case. Within 20 minutes of arriving, 3 different people approached me to introduce themselves and share how my case had inspired them to report their own experiences of medical mistreatment. One woman said she'd filed a complaint against her dentist who made inappropriate comments during procedures. Another man described reporting his physical therapist for boundary violations. A third woman was in the middle of a medical board investigation against her former psychiatrist. They all thanked me for speaking publicly about what happened because seeing someone else go through the process gave them courage to come forward. The community impact felt real and tangible in a way that made me emotional. I wasn't just one person who fought back anymore, but part of a larger movement toward accountability. Catherine texted me a few weeks after the fundraiser asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. We met at a place near her new workplace on a Saturday morning. She told me about the women's health clinic where she'd been working for the past 3 months and how different the culture was from Harrison's practice. Her new doctors actually listened when staff members raised concerns about patient care. They prioritized patient dignity and comfort, instead of rushing through appointments to maximize billing. The clinic had clear policies about appropriate conduct and took complaints seriously instead of covering them up. Catherine said that standing up as a witness in my case helped her find her own voice professionally because she realized she didn't have to accept toxic work environments or stay silent about unethical behavior. She'd already reported one concerning incident at her new workplace and felt supported by management instead of punished for speaking up. Seeing her thrive in a better situation made me happy because she'd risked a lot by testifying against Harrison. A few months after my coffee meeting with Catherine, I got an email from someone named Dr. Daniela Webb at the State Medical Association. She explained that Harrison's malpractice insurance company had raised his rates by over 300% because of all the complaints and the settlement. Even if he wanted to come back after his suspension ended, the insurance costs would make it almost impossible for him to afford practicing medicine. The market was punishing him in ways that went beyond just the medical board's official actions. I forwarded the email to Gabriella, who responded that financial consequences often proved more effective than formal penalties in keeping bad doctors out of medicine. Harrison wasn't just facing a temporary suspension anymore, but real barriers that would follow him for the rest of his career. Almost exactly a year after the exam room incident, I received an invitation to speak on a panel at the state medical school. The topic was patient-centered care and professional boundaries, and the dean wanted someone who could talk about the real impact of inappropriate medical conduct. I felt nervous about standing in front of future doctors and reliving what happened, but I also saw it as a chance to prevent other patients from going through similar experiences. My husband encouraged me to accept, reminding me how many women had thanked me for speaking up. I agreed to participate and spent the next 2 weeks preparing what I wanted to say. The panel took place in a large lecture hall with about 200 medical students in attendance. I sat between a hospital ethics director and a patient advocacy lawyer while we each gave our presentations. When my turn came, I told them exactly what Harrison had said during my exam and how his words made me feel powerless and violated. I watched the students' faces shift from casual attention to genuine shock as I described the specific comments. After the presentations ended, at least a dozen students came up to thank me and promised they would never treat patients that way. One young woman told me she'd experienced something similar from a doctor during high school and had almost given up on becoming a physician herself. Talking to those future doctors felt like the most meaningful prevention work I could do, because changing medical culture had to start with the people entering the profession. My daily life looked completely normal again by this point, but I noticed real changes in myself that felt positive rather than just recovered. I spoke up immediately now when something felt wrong instead of questioning whether I had the right to object. I knew exactly what my rights were as a patient, and wasn't afraid to advocate for myself in medical settings or anywhere else. The support group I joined had connected me with people working on healthcare reform projects, and I stayed involved because I wanted to help fix the systems that had protected Harrison for so long. The trauma from that exam room hadn't disappeared, but it had led to growth I never expected. I was stronger, more confident, and more connected to a community of people fighting to make healthcare safer and more respectful for everyone. Sitting in my living room one evening about 14 months after everything started, I realized I felt genuinely happy and at peace with how things had turned out. Harrison faced real consequences that would follow him for years, not just a slap on the wrist. Other patients were protected because he couldn't practice anymore, and the medical practice had implemented actual policy changes. The system had been forced to respond in meaningful ways instead of just covering up another complaint. And I had discovered strength I didn't know I had by refusing to stay silent when someone in power abused that position. Sometimes standing up for yourself does more than just heal your own wounds. It helps heal the broken systems that allowed the harm in the first place.